Welcome to Community Wealth Ontario. My name is Colin. Anthes. I'll be your MC this afternoon. Before we jump in with some very worthy guests, I'd like to take a moment to acknowledge that our work takes place across the traditional homes of many First Nations, Inuit, and Métis peoples who continue to live and work and play in these communities. I personally am speaking from the traditional homes of the Haudenosaunee and Anishinaabe peoples, and we engage in this work with a firm commitment to processes of truth and reconciliation, processes of cooperation and respect, and processes that follow the lead of the traditional caretakers of these lands, acting with consideration for the well-being of the 7 generations yet to come. Welcome. Community wealth building began as a surprisingly successful initiative pulling people out of poverty in a deeply, deeply underprivileged neighborhood in Cleveland, Ohio. And that work in Cleveland has since substantially expanded and is now also being used to save jobs in companies with retiring baby boomer entrepreneurs, transitioning those companies into employee ownership within a broader community wealth framework. A larger version of that model was then taken across the pond and further refined in the city of Preston, England, which went on to be named the most improved city in the United Kingdom. We're deeply privileged to have Matthew Brown as a keynote speaker this afternoon, who is council lead in Preston. Since then, community wealth building initiatives have been popping up around the world, from small towns to capital cities. The Scottish national government now includes it as strategy towards its well-being objectives. This past year in the United States, the Housing and Urban Development Department put community wealth building into its $68 billion strategic plan. And Kate Raworth has it as go-to methodology for implementing her donut economics at the local level. So there's been quite a domino effect in a very short period of time. It's only about 17 years removed from when this was work being done in one part of one city. There are perhaps 3 main reasons why community wealth building has been so rapidly expanding. The first is it's been working, and not many of the economic strategies of the last half century have been working. So as people sift through their options, it's one of the few things that keeps on catching in the sieve. The second is it is in theory, and sometimes actually in practice, the place in which those on the progressive end of the spectrum and those of a more conservative bent are actually able to work together quite productively. On the one hand, it expands resources that are, in one form or another, under working class control, the old goal of the socialist left. On the other hand, it is perhaps more firmly rooted in local decision-making, decentralization, reward for initiative, and efficient use of resources than anything else currently on offer. The third reason is it offers communities an opportunity to break the vicious cycle of the current standard model of economic development. And I emphasize the word current there because it may not be the model of economic development moving forward. But right now, many communities are still trying to attract outside businesses. They do this by providing large tax breaks, often direct subsidies, and engaging in multi-million-dollar publicly funded projects on behalf of those interests. The result is that the wealthy get very well funded, and a large portion of our investment immediately goes directly out of our communities into the hands of a small number of corporate owners who might live anywhere, and who often further save the profits into offshore tax havens, so they no longer touch anything that our community is connected to. This becomes a cyclical problem, as those are very footloose interests that can continue to threaten to take their jobs and investment elsewhere, which they sometimes do. Community wealth building begins and continues to build in the exact opposite direction, looking at the assets a community already has at its disposal and offering coherent strategies for continuing to build wealth on this foundation for the benefit of the people who actually live and work there. The premise is very simple. We first look at the ways members of different kinds of communities are able to hold wealth in common. A community of workers that has ownership stake of the company that they work for and access to that company's profits, the best version of which is a worker cooperative because it's also democratic, is a terrific example of a community holding a source of wealth in common. And worker-owned companies and worker cooperatives have higher rates of success than standard startup enterprise, so they're also good for sustainability and resilience. A community land trust, in which a plot of land is taken off the market and placed under the permanent control of a local nonprofit, is a very versatile source of community wealth, but is most commonly used to provide permanent, intergenerational, affordable housing, which is of increasing relevance as Ontario prepares for a significant population boom in the coming decades. Anchor institutions. We all have nonprofits, public, quasi-public enterprise that cannot simply get up and relocate somewhere else. Schools, hospitals, libraries, colleges and universities, cultural and religious institutions, transit commissions not only provide ongoing sources of value for our communities, but are also potential sources of investment and employment. They all have to purchase lots of goods and services from outside organizations, in total many billions of dollars worth. They often purchase those from multinational corporations, and the profits go into offshore tax havens. But they can also purchase locally and anchor other good jobs in the community, as well as looking to hire locally when acting as employers. We gather these different sources of community wealth, and then we look at how they can be used to support each other and build off of each other, so that we can have loans from credit unions, cooperative banks, seed grants from municipal governments to start worker-owned cooperatives in our community. We can have anchor institutions that purchase goods and services from local worker-owned companies. The profits then go into the hands of many different local worker owners who continue to spend that money locally. It continues to circulate and build wealth in our community, good, straightforward economics. And then as the prosperity grows and the land values go up, we've got our community land trust there to capture a portion of them, keep people from being pushed out through gentrification, and keep the land values going back into our community. Potentially, we can have the whole gamut: the good investment, the good stable worker-owned jobs, and the affordable housing in perpetuity. That's the framework that we'll be looking at over the next couple of hours in more detail. First, looking at how these principles get implemented on the ground floor, talking to Councillor Matthew Brown about the work done in Preston, England. Then we're going to turn to some local resources, talking about how some of the work is being developed here in Canada with the Ontario Cooperative Association, Social Capital Partners, and the Co-op Zone. At any time, you can put questions you may have into the live chat. I see some people already putting some things in there. Fantastic. Welcome, everybody. And I will be keeping track of those. I also have some prompts from some councillors in attendance today on topics they would like me to try to make sure we get to. So I'm going to do my best to make sure we get to all of that within the 2 hours that we have today. In the event that we don't get to all of that within the time constraints, I will keep track of all those inputs, and I will make sure that I provide you with feedback if you have any questions that we do not get to in those 2 hours. So please consider this a participatory event, and please consider this part of an ongoing conversation on how we build sustainable and inclusive forms of wealth in a challenging moment in our diverse communities. Without further ado, I would like to invite Matthew Brown to come on in. And Matthew is zooming in from the future. He's 5 hours ahead in England. So we're going to put him first. And I would like to also acknowledge that Matthew was in on the game very early. He saw principles at play in Cleveland that he realized could be applied productively in a different city in a different country. And that ended up really lifting up the horizons of what people were thinking about with community wealth building. So it's a great honor and privilege to introduce Councillor Matthew Brown. Matthew, welcome.
Hello, good afternoon, everyone over in Canada. Lovely to be here. Can people see my slides okay?
Yes.
Fantastic. All right. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take you through the experience in Preston around community wealth building and how we've started a bit of a conversation around how we can do things very, very differently within our communities. Obviously, I'm leader of the City Council, but I also do some work for this organisation you might have heard of, the Democracy Collaborative, which is tasked to build a democratic economy in place. But what I'll do is I'll start with the work in Preston that has gone on for about 10 years now, and I'll explain why we did what we did, but crucially why we feel these ideas, even though they do take time and you need different layers to be placed on them, are spreading so quickly just because we feel people need a bit of hope about what might be an alternative. So what I'll do is I'll take you back to quite some time ago. So from the late 90s onwards in Preston, we did work with quite large corporate outside developers. Now, Preston is a smallish city in the northwest of England, a population of about 140,000. It's probably in between Manchester and Liverpool, that are probably better known in my country in the northwest. And we worked with quite large developers to try and bring a situation where we regenerated our city centre, because the investment in the city centre had been needed probably since the mid to late 1980s. So the common way of doing things back then from the 90s onwards, and still now to a degree, was that you try to rely primarily on inward investment. So that means that you do try to attract larger businesses from outside. And often a way of facilitating that, as Colin said before, is you've got to try and offer some quite significant incentives which see a wealth extraction. So in our instance, we set up a vehicle that would put a significant amount of municipally owned land in a 50-50 partnership with the developer. And then from that, we then get the larger businesses in, you know, restaurants, department stores, cinemas, housing, and the rest. And then we pursued that for over 10 years. And without going into the details of why it didn't come to fruition, it basically didn't, because there was, you know, all kinds of issues around that, developing our city in that way. But the final nail in the coffin was when in 2011, late 2011, John Lewis, which was going to be one of our anchor tenants, pulled out of the development. So in our city centre, we'd spent over 10 years trying to bring this money in from outside. That's failed. We're also facing the 2007-8 economic crash and the effects of that, which is pretty devastating. And then as well, we're facing a situation of austerity, which was very deep in our country. So obviously the financial crash of 2007-8 was an international situation, but I think it was felt more acutely in the UK, which had had a bigger dose of neoliberal economics. So the taxpayer then had to bail out the financial system, and from that was austerity. So local government, local councils were particularly badly hit. So we then win an election in 2011 in the UK Labour Party for the council, got a majority for the first time in some years. Quite excited, but we got a dynamic where big business doesn't want to come in. We got a situation where there's austerity, and also there's a fallout from the 2007-8 economic crash. I think the year before 2011, there was just 5 houses built within the city. You know, everything was pretty much a complete mess. So crucially, community wealth building was inspired by more radical progressive economics, but it was in many ways a very common sense approach, because basically we had very little wriggle room to actually do things, and just being dependent on the private sector from outside or government wasn't going to cut it. So I'll go through some of the policies that we did implement. So firstly, we realised that even though we're having issues getting larger businesses to relocate and develop our city centre, we are quite wealthy in the sense that we do have lots of anchor institutions, which are not-for-profit institutions in the public sector in the UK mainly, which aren't going to get up and leave. And they were spending nearly £1 billion a year on goods and services. So we encourage them to spend a lot more, especially with locally based businesses. We insourced a number of services, not many, because we hadn't outsourced an awful lot, but we did that. But we worked with anchor partners who themselves insourced activity back into the local public sector. We worked with our public pension fund and encouraged it to invest £100 million in both the Preston and South Ribble economy. That's still work ongoing, but there's been quite a significant amount that has been invested so far within our city and the neighbouring district. We've worked to establish new worker-owned businesses with Mondragon Cooperative Corporation, who did some consultancy for us. Our university have established a cooperative development network. Now there's about 6 or 7 worker co-ops we've incubated. And obviously, you know, we want a lot more and more people within them. It's not an easy thing to do, but you know, we're committed to do that and actually have a more democratic economy, especially in the commercial sector. We're establishing across the region a cooperative bank. In the UK, we don't have cooperative banks, and we're establishing a regional cooperative bank called Northwest Mutual. And we support Preston's Credit Union and also a CDFI called Lancashire Community Finance. We worked to become the first living wage employer in the north of England. Now, that is a voluntary standard where employees pay significantly above what the government minimum is. So in the UK, that's currently £10.90, and we encourage our anchor institutions to pay the real living wage as well. We're regenerating our city centre. This is close now to £100 million, primarily in local public ownership. So we're building a cinema, we're refurbishing disused council-owned buildings, for local businesses. We're doing many other things, and we're doing it in local public ownership. We're looking to provide public housing again in Preston. That's not been done for 30 or 40 years. It is difficult because The Conservative government doesn't really give us the flexibilities to do that, but we think we can do it, and we're determined to make a start on that very soon. We've got planning policies, which encourages local suppliers and local labour on public and commercial sector developments in the Preston economy. And obviously that's the planning system that we have in the UK, which can often be quite helpful to achieving community wealth building outcomes. And then last year, we refreshed our community wealth building policies. So we got a new community land trust in Preston, the first in central Lancashire. Our NHS especially is recruiting in the areas of highest deprivation. We're looking to work with our anchor partners at how we can generate energy in public, community and cooperative ownership. And then we're looking at other ways to expand democratic firms, especially through retrofitting in the clean energy sector. So you put that together and you've got the basis for what might be described a democratic economy within the place we are anyway. So I'll just give you an example of how some of these economic alternatives are very common sense. They're seen as radical. They do actually scare people. But if you actually live in the communities like Mondragon or the communities I'm going to mention now, where one aspect of it is applied quite sensibly, it's very common sense to the people who live there, really. So in the UK, for example, I think 92% of personal banking is done by 5 large investor-owned banks. It's very different banking in other parts of the world. So on the right's the German banking system. That's called the Sparkassen. And crucially, that's a major part of the banking system in Germany, which is mainly done by cooperatives, charitable and locally owned public sector banks. And I think about 60% of banking is done through a kind of a not for dividend situation. And what we found in 2007-8 was when the economic crash did come in Germany, the taxpayer was often bailing out the larger banks, but where the Sparkassen and other cooperative banks did predominate in towns, villages and cities, they were actually avoiding recession because they were lending to local businesses, whereas the taxpayer was bailing out the larger banks. On the left, it's someone who's attending the Occupy Wall Street demonstrations in 2011, obviously in America. And he's actually saying how good the Bank of North Dakota is, which is the only publicly owned bank in America. And that's been around since, I think, the early 20th century. It's in public ownership and it devolves itself down into communities in North Dakota, originally established to support agricultural communities. And again, crucially, when the economic crash of 2007-8 came to America, I think unemployment in North Dakota was around 40% of the rest of America. And a big part of that was the fact they managed to democratize how banking is done with those communities. So in Preston, we're establishing the Northwest Mutual. It's going to be like any other banks. It's going to have a footprint of about 5 million, we think. And we've got other councils partnering with us on this. And the idea is we're going to have an alternative, because what we're seeing is large banks withdrawing from our communities. We're seeing branches closed. And we feel we've got to have the courage to actually say we need to have an alternative in terms of economic ownership of a customer-owned cooperative bank. And why do we think we need this? And on the left, you see how the large banks tend to operate. As you see, in terms of the financial sector, they tend to want to lend to each other rather than lend, say, 1,000 lots of £20,000 to small businesses in our communities. And on the right is in the northwest of England, loans to small businesses, how they quite significantly dropped. And that's after a huge amount of public wealth was used to bail out the banking system. And another example, which is quite inspiring, is doesn't sound particularly exciting, doesn't it? But in terms of public pension wealth, very significant in the sense public pension funds in our country are worth about 330 billion. And this is another example, again, an American example in Alabama. Situation there is that I think in the early 90s, they decided to invest at least 10% directly within the state where the majority of the public pension wealth did originate from. So quite a lot less in Wall Street, quite a lot more within their own state economy. That developed, I think, 15 or 16 golf courses. They built hotels with the public pension fund. They acquired media companies. And crucially on the left is the direct and indirect benefits of just investing a little more of your public pension fund within your local community. And I see quite impressive figures, nearly £300,000, 300,000 jobs over that 21-22 year period. So in Preston, this is what we've done. We've worked with our public pension fund. It's developed some student accommodation. That was an £18 million development in one of our main streets in Preston. As you can see on the left, it was run down very close to the university. It's now student accommodation. There was a local not-for-profit developer that did the developing. Local companies were involved to a degree in the construction and development phase. We've got students in there now who are actually contributing to the community, and the workers at the time obviously paid local taxes to local government. So you get a virtuous cycle of economic activity. And then this is the cinema that we're developing. It's called Animate. Crucially, the failure of the big developer-led approach we've learned from. So we do need to regenerate our city centre, but we're doing it in local public ownership. That is going to start next month. I think I'll have a photo opportunity, which I'm not the most natural at, with a spade next month in Preston. But crucially, this is going to be publicly owned, £45 million development. And again, we have a say over local supply chains, environmental standards, union access during the construction development phase, and obviously the companies that we have within the development. There's going to be some national restaurant chains, but there's also going to be a lot of independent businesses, because obviously we need to get the return that's needed. But crucially, it's being done in local public ownership, which we find very, very exciting. And then I talked about the work with anchor institutions. We work with a think tank stroke charity called CLES, based in Manchester. So in 2013, just 5% was being spent within Preston. And just by going through a quite significant cultural change in terms of procurement, there was an extra 75 million that was spent by 2017. Now, since then, crucially, we got the university and hospital as anchor partners, and the hospital, for example, during the COVID pandemic, bought some masks from a Preston-based company. I think that was 40% of masks that were being used by patients and hospital staff. And I think that was equivalent to creating 90 jobs. So that was a £4 million contract. So we're getting a culture of collaboration from our anchor institutions around community wealth building within Preston. This was the time that we insourced one of our venues back into the local public sector. As I said, the vast majority of our services were not outsourced, but we did bring that back into the local public sector. Additionally, the Police and Crime Commissioner in the largest housing association also insourced services away from mainly corporations back into local public sector. So they're also under democratic control as well, and the workers can receive a real living wage and other benefits. And then here's some of the worker co-ops we've established. This is the first union co-op in the UK. It's Preston Cooperative Education Centre, established with our trade unions. The idea is that we encourage other worker co-ops in Preston to come into fruition with union support. And I say we've got 6 or 7 registered at this moment in time. We want a lot more, but crucially, a lot more people working within them and changing the culture in communities that, you don't have to work for a boss. You can actually self-organize in a business you own collectively and democratically and get the benefits of that. And that is very difficult in our country, getting that culture into people's heads, because we've had so many decades of neoliberal economics and free market economics. But again, we're determined to keep at it and try to encourage people that there's ways which themselves and the families can benefit themselves by organising in democratic companies. I need to go back just 1 second. This is a second worker cooperative called Preston Digital Foundation. This was university graduates and university lecturer that formed a worker co-op. Crucially, it's contracted with one of our anchor institutions, the university, so they've procured some work from them. And again, that's obviously young people who are staying within the community, which is really positive. This is some other cooperatives we have. This is Leighton Street Housing Cooperative. This is a traveller community. They potentially faced eviction because there's 2 tiers of government in Lancashire. The Conservative-led county council were looking to offload the site. The city council I run, we acquired the site, and then we've encouraged them to establish a housing cooperative. So obviously very happy indeed, because there's a potentially situation where they'd have been evicted through the sale of the site. And obviously that's now under democratic ownership, that the community themselves own and run the housing, which is very positive. And again, this is the first community land trust in central Lancashire. This is a church which is looking to redevelop itself and obviously be a community faith expression within Preston, but also there's going to be 14 affordable houses. And again, community land trusts aren't that well known in our country, but if you get one, potentially it can expand, you can get others. So you can see how this movement is building very much in our community. And then obviously very positive, all these things. It is tough because there's different layers that actually need to be put in place to bring about that transformation. But some of the early policies around affordable housing policies, around real living wage policies, around procurement policies and employment, it did contribute, I think in late 2018, to us being named the most improved city in the UK. And then crucially as well, we've actually seen a reduction in child poverty in the last 4 years. We're quite a deprived community. Child poverty has fallen by over 10% in the official government statistics out quite recently. And it's no coincidence that we do have so many living wage employers that pay a family supporting minimum. We do require developers to provide affordable housing on all developments over a certain size. We work with anchor partners as well to free up land for affordable housing. And we do lots of work around tackling food poverty, of which we're looking at food cooperatives quite shortly. So, it's no coincidence that we've actually done pretty well compared to other areas in terms of reducing child poverty within our local authority area. So very excited what we're doing. It's still a journey we're on, to be honest. And, I'd probably say we're halfway through it, but I'm determined to finish the job off and really try to bring about a much more democratic economy in Preston, where we actually move beyond the current economic model and create something fairer and more equal. And I think to do that, I've learned very much that we've got to actually do it from the top down, but also build grassroots support also. So I'll just mention about how community wealth building, how it was unheard of about 10 years ago, how it's really spread across the United Kingdom and abroad. That is Mondragon, obviously a network of worker-owned businesses in the Basque Country, Spain. But in the UK, what we've seen is a culture of insourcing of public sector services, as you can see on the top left. We've got a quite radical Labour First Minister in Wales running the Welsh Assembly. He's establishing a Welsh community bank that's working with our own. They're looking at a Marcora law to encourage workers to have the first opportunity to buy businesses which are either converting or going out of business. They're looking at public generation of energy there through a publicly owned Welsh energy company. You've got Oxford, who are committed to doubling the size of the cooperative economy in terms of worker and employee ownership. Sheffield, Greater Manchester and London have recently launched ownership hubs. The Mayor of London launched the ownership hub just on Friday in London, which is going to operate from January 2013. Hackney and North Ayrshire, for example, are two areas that are expanding and developing municipal energy production in the UK. And as you said earlier, quite significantly, the Scottish Government has launched a community wealth building approach across the whole country. They've got a Minister for Community Wealth Building, and the North of Ireland have commissioned a report now for the Stormont Assembly about how they can adopt a community wealth building approach in the North of Ireland. And very mainstream, both the NHS Long-Term Plan and Civic Universities Commission, they call themselves anchor institutions now, looking at where they recruit, where they hire, what they do with the land and assets. And in the NHS long-term plan, for example, even under a Conservative-led government, it does mention that they will behave in that way. And you're seeing quite interesting expressions of how that's happening across the UK. And Sadiq Khan is a Mayor of London, who I mentioned earlier. He's launched a £73 billion anchor network in Greater London to look at how they can recover from COVID. So that is the website. So as you can see, the London Anchor Institutions Network, it's looking at good jobs, looking at getting young people into work, but also to move towards net zero by 2030. So again, that's a culture of collaboration with anchor institutions, not just seeing themselves as police forces, universities, hospitals, further education colleges, to seeing how they can economically and socially and environmentally lift up the community. Some more examples. This is a quite large community land trust in in Merseyside City region. So you've got a mayor there called Steve Rotherham, and he's launched a land commission, and a big part of that is ensuring that publicly owned land can be used to develop community-led housing initiatives like CLTs. And again, that's quite significant. There's going to be some extra properties there. I think there's going to be a care facility as well. So nearly 200 properties in CLT ownership, which is pretty unheard of in the UK, in some parts of our country. But what we're seeing here is a push towards that being in the mainstream when it comes to housing. This is the Sheffield Ownership Hub, which was launched by the then Mayor Dan Jarvis, again, supporting conversions into employee and worker ownership. Apologies for the extremely poor quality of the picture, but that is the Welsh community bank called Bank Cambria. That is due to launch very, very soon. And again, they expect and they plan through the plan to have 30 new branches across Wales. So everyone within Wales will be within 30 or 40 minutes of a banking branch. And again, I mentioned about the failure of large banks and the way they behave often in our country, in the UK. And then that's just a couple of months back. It might even be last month, actually. That's Deirdre Hargey, who's the Deputy First Minister of the North of Ireland. And on the right is Joe Gwynon, who's, I think, soon to be the president of the Democracy Cooperative. And again, they're launching a report across the Northern Ireland, how we advance community wealth building, commissioned by the Northern Ireland government. And then internationally, I mean, some of it's been alluded to. We've even had interest in Africa, looking at cooperatives, worker cooperatives and community banking. Interesting work in Sydney. There was a independent member called Jess Scully who did some work around procurement, but now the whole Sydney Council's looking at a community wealth building strategy. In America, San Francisco, Los Angeles are looking at exploring how they can establish publicly owned banks within America. You've got New York City, which is expanding worker-owned businesses. And Chicago this year launched a citywide community wealth building strategy. The European Union did some work with our council and 7 European cities about how anchor institutions can, through procurement especially, lead to more vibrant communities. But now both Amsterdam and Barcelona are looking at citywide community wealth building strategies. And I know there's lots of work in Canada, obviously, with yourselves, with community wealth candidates, but the Atkinson Foundation and others, it really is spreading significantly. And very interestingly, the trade union movement in America is looking at how they can acquire companies and put them into worker trusts, because union density in America is pretty bad. It's around sometimes less than 10%. So they're seeing it as a way to expand union membership by obviously doing what they do already in terms of negotiating and taking action when needed and providing benefits to members. But they're also seeing how they can acquire companies in in workers' trusts and run them as democratic companies that are unionised. And there's a similar kind of like conversation here with the Communication Workers Union that's looking at exactly the same, how they can look at supporting worker ownership in post offices and also broadband as well. So thank you very much. I'll just give you a couple more examples. That's Evergreen Cooperatives, which was alluded to before. That's using the not-for-profit procurement power of local anchor institutions to create worker-owned businesses linked to that procurement power. And there's over 400 people within the Evergreen Cooperatives at this moment in time. This is the Sydney Council website showing that they're looking to themselves adopt a community wealth building strategy. And then that's the Mayor of Chicago, Lori Lightfoot. And obviously, you know, she's committed to a community wealth building pilot worth, I think, 15 million. And it's crucially trying to tackle the racial injustice that you do get within quite deeply in parts of America, because I think they've come to the conclusion that to do that, you can't be doing it by skirting around the edges. You need to look at who actually owns the resources of the local and regional and city economy. And obviously, the reality is that minority communities and the less well-off generally, but minority communities in particular, are left outside the labour market. So it's very exciting, all these things about, you know, what happened in Preston and what happened in Cleveland before that, and the inspirations from Mondragon, how in just a few years it's really taken off as a movement and it's getting political support locally, regionally, nationally. So we're onto something quite significant. And I think the the fallout from the last economic recession, the international crisis we had 15 years ago, I think people are crying out for something different. And I think people really want to learn from that and actually do something that's going to be transformative. So thanks for the invite. And any questions or any discussion, please do that now. Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you so much for that, Matthew. It was a wonderful presentation. And I have a question from the chat I want to bring in a moment. But first, just something I wanted to add to what you said there. It doesn't get out very often in Canada because it's actually in one of our most conservative provinces, the province of Alberta. But we have a public bank in Alberta that is 7 times the size of the Bank of North Dakota. So sometimes these things pop up in places that people wouldn't expect because, as you say, they make sense at the grassroots level, whereas they might not make so much sense to people when there's a big ideological national level conversation going on. Some of these things actually get implemented really well in some unusual places. That was a fantastic presentation. I have a question here from Nathan about what are some of the biggest barriers that you face to community wealth building today, and are they consistent across different geographies? So really going into when you're getting this stuff going, what are some of the obstacles that pop up and how do those get worked through?
I think firstly, I think people are scared of new ideas. I think that is the first thing. I think people find new ideas difficult, especially when it comes to economic development. Things have been done in such a way for such a long time. So I think it's the culture that we do have around economic development and even politics that people find challenging. That if you're actually saying something very different, that is going to be a challenge for some people. And then I think in our country especially, a lot of it is restrictions on local and regional government, which do get in the way. And I've come to the conclusion some time back that the way around that is to put new democratic institutions in place, like potentially municipally owned developments expanding, like alternative banking arrangements, like community land trusts, like worker and employee ownership, like democratically run energy that might be cooperatively run. So I think that's the way that we're getting around it, in the sense that we are purposefully restricted in terms of what we can and cannot do, I feel. But the way around that is by putting these alternatives into communities. And as you've seen with my presentation and some of the other parts of how community wealth building is being implemented, it's been done pretty successfully. Yeah,
fantastic. I had a question about, at the very, very beginning, as you were starting to set up a community wealth building approach in Preston, what were the nitty gritty of the first steps? Was the first thing that you did looking at anchor institutions or a needs assessment, or what was your very first entry point?
Well, we did things which were quite easy, in the sense it's quite easy to become accredited as a living wage employer and then encourage others to do that. So that was done informally. We also worked with a partner area who had a credit union, and we worked with them to expand the common bond to Preston. So these were some of the early things we did. But I think the real tipping point was when we came across Ted Howard and what he was saying about anchor institutions and how they've done what they've done in terms of worker ownership linked to that procurement. So it really did get started quite seriously around 2013, where what we did is we convened the institutions together at a city council level, and then we started working with procurement teams and doing quite technical things like spend analysis. So looking at where public wealth was spent through the procurement processes, looking at how we could potentially streamline that activity, make it a lot easier for smaller companies to win contracts, have meet the buyer days, etc., etc. So that's how it started then. But procurement was always one part of it. People portray the Preston model often as being this protectionist expression where we're just buying locally. It's always been a lot more than that. There's different layers, you see. So obviously we got partnerships now around worker ownership. Obviously we've got the bank, we've got many other policies really, but we started probably with the easy things and then procurement, because from that can then lead to other things, which I explained during the presentation really. But procurement's quite easy in the sense that if you're elected to a city council or wherever, you actually have control to a degree over where you spend your money. So that was a good place to start, and that's where we did start really.
That's fantastic. I wondered, I have a question from Haley Bateman, who's a regional councillor in Niagara. What is the investment to get started? What's the, okay, I think that question is about like, what were the first kinds of payments that you had to put forward? What were the first things you put money into to get the ball rolling?
Well, I mean, obviously, if we do increase the wages of our staff, then obviously that's a bit of a cost. But it was quite cheap generally in terms of doing this, in the sense that in terms of the procurement work, we did obviously work internally, we worked with experts. So it was, I think, initially about £30,000 just to have them as consultants that would help go around and convince people this was the right thing to do. And then, you know, some of the other policies around the community bank, that's going to need £20 million of investment, we think. Might be a little more now. And obviously we're going to put a certain amount in through where we invest, but there's also other councils that can do similar. In terms of the cooperatives, we did put a bit of cash into that, but we also found that there was quite a lot of external funders who were very interested in what we were doing. So we actually attracted money to establish worker cooperatives. And then sometimes we get experts come in from outside that just want to help often, and they actually do a lot of this pro bono. So in terms of the Community Land Trust, the guy who's working, he used to work for one of our anchors, he's called Paul actually. He started working for Liverpool City region on their Community Land Trust. And then there was interest from Preston. So he started working in Preston. So what you find is if you make a start somewhere, often you get to a tipping point where you get a number of institutions and organisations doing things. And obviously the council has a budget, but if our housing association, for example, does exactly the same, then you bring additional resource into it.
Right. And that's also very clear in your presentation, just how decentralized the number of partners are that are involved in the project there. You have a lot of different community partners who are in their own way getting involved in that process. And I wondered if there was a key moment in which those partners started to really snowball for you. Was it something that happened right out of the gates, or was there sort of a critical mass moment in which the partners started to come through the door?
I think we just had lots of luck and we're quite persuasive, really. I think I can't think there's any more complex answer than that, because yeah, I mean, we approached all of them and they all agreed to take part in the procurement work and some of the other work as well. What I think did help is the ideas we were implementing in Preston did start getting significant notoriety, both in our country and beyond, because very rare that a city or an authority is actually saying that they want to do things that are that radical and want to, in many ways, tear up the current rule book and write a new one. That did get us lots and lots of interest, which I think did actually help in many ways, that people could see that what the council was doing was actually getting lots and lots of interest from many places. But that in itself has a downside, because there's lots of expectation, and then often there's people who just want to hear about what we're doing as well. Well, obviously that takes resources away from us actually doing it, because this is such a big agenda. It needs our staff, especially, to be on this pretty much 24/7, right. You know, and I feel quite bad sometimes when we say, well, we don't have the time to speak to X person and Y person who just wants to learn about what we're doing, just because we don't have the time, to be honest.
Right, right. I have another question for you, which is, could you speak a little bit more to the way that this approach is allowing the city of Preston to think about, and you touched on it a little bit in your presentation, but to think about environmental issues at this moment of, and I know you've actually been, I believe, a presenter for the Action Lab of Donuts Economics before with Kate Raworth, but can you talk a little bit about how you're putting environmental frameworks into this community wealth building approach?
Yeah, indeed. I mean, firstly, what we are doing is lobbying for money from government to do things like retrofitting homes, which is not enough. And this is a challenge we always face, that if we don't receive the support that's needed to deal with these matters, it's very difficult to do it on your own, really. So that's the first thing. We are lobbying quite strongly for that. But we've done things around the public pension fund, really working to make sure that invested a lot more in our community. But also, I was part of a subgroup that looked at ethical investment, because obviously we're trying to get it to divest as far as it can from fossil fuels. So that's one thing we're doing. In terms of the developments, they're going to be, because they are in local public ownership, they're going to be developed to the highest environmental standards. And obviously, when we do procure as well, we do encourage, environmental responsibilities there as well, you see. So that's how we're moving towards. But in terms of the systemic change, we believe that by working with partners to encourage either public or cooperative generation of energy, that's one way that we can get over some of the challenges we face around environmental crisis situations. Just because, the current infrastructure in terms of the national grid, it's very inefficient. I think there's probably 60-70% of energy that's lost through the national grid that supplies the majority of our utilities in this country. And obviously generating it in local public and cooperative ownership, we feel, is one way of doing that and making sure we do it a lot more efficiently. And then crucially, we also feel that through retrofitting, worker co-ops can be very good in terms of encouraging that participation and actually tackling the climate emergency and getting communities and workers involved in that as well. So, yes, we're very keen on looking at that. It's just with all these things, we're just pretty restricted often by our government, really.
Right. Well, I'd suggest write to the Prime Minister, but I don't know who might be next week. So it's. I would like to thank you very much for that presentation. Oh, I do have some more questions coming in. In my area, we have credit unions and living wage employers. What's a logical next step? So if there's a foot in the door already with credit unions, which are our cooperative banks over here, and I'm sure the Ontario Cooperative Association will enjoy following up on that as well. And we already have some living wage employers. Can that be a foot in the door for a next step? And obviously that was some of the things that did follow logically in your case in Preston. But was there a logical next action after you had those kinds of partners lined up?
Yes, that's a very good question, actually, because those things are quite easy to do. It's a lot more difficult establishing community land trusts and worker-owned businesses and other things. But if you do start with, promoting and expanding credit unions and living wage employment, then I think that is obviously a very good first step indeed. I'm not sure how the credit union movement is in Canada. I should imagine it's a lot bigger than ours. I think we've only got 2 or 3% of market share, so it's very small and always has been, quite restricted. But we want to work with credit unions, but we also want to have fully licensed banking alternatives as well that can work with credit unions, because we feel having a licensed banks, whether they're public or cooperatively owned, they can lend a lot. So a 20 million starts in terms of initial seed funding for a bank. If you do get a banking license, that can get to about $1 billion in about 8 years, and it can compete with the large banks. And sadly, in our country, credit unions can't do that. So it's very frustrating, and that's why we're doing it that way. But it might be different in Canada, in Ontario. I think also encouraging community wealth building through publicly owned land, because there's so much you can do with publicly owned land and assets to actually deliver these ideas. And I think the culture often is that you just will often allow quite a large company that might not treat the environment and the staff and the community that well to take a council asset, but you can do it quite differently, really. I think that's a really positive way to do it as well.
Fantastic answer. And thank you so much, Matthew. You've given such a rounded presentation. You've shown how these principles played out so well, all the different ways that people can get involved in community wealth building as well, all those different kinds of partners, which is so important. And also looking at how you're fostering forms of prosperity and also taking care of the needs of the most vulnerable so well. I'm sure, the Ontario Cooperative Association is going to be really happy to see those examples of people who are in danger of being evicted turning into democratic owners of the places that they lived in. We have been facing an eviction crisis over here in Ontario. So that's a really, really important example for us. But all the work that you've been doing in Preston is very, very inspiring. Obviously, it's inspired work in many places, but it's been very inspiring to me and to the people working here in Ontario on this work. So thank you so much for your presentation. Thank you for being here. We really, really appreciate it. I would now like to invite John Schell, who is a managing director and a partner at Social Capital Partners, a really important group doing some fantastic work here in Canada. So John, would you kindly take the microphone and welcome.
Thanks, Colin. And I'm sorry I missed Matthew's presentation. I know of the work, and we're big fans of what you're doing over in the UK. Look, maybe what I'll quickly talk about here today is, employee ownership trusts. I think that's my mandate, Colin, and I'll talk about, what they are, why we think they're such a big opportunity, and a little about where we are on them in Canada. And I preface this by saying we are big fans of the cooperative model. Social Capital Partners has been involved in cooperative activities over the past 20 years. So, the employee ownership trust we see as a different and useful option alongside the cooperative model. I want to just say that up front, because I know there's some folks on the call who are from the cooperative movement who we've worked with and talked with a lot over the previous years. So, I imagine this has come up and will come up on this call, the idea that we are facing what is often called a silver tsunami, which is the retirement of baby boomers who own privately owned businesses here in Canada, and really this is true around the world, or at least in sort of Western countries. And often when we talk about that issue, we think about mom and pop type businesses, your sort of local convenience store, hardware store, etc. But what is also true about the privately held companies, in that category, is between companies with employees between 20 and 500. So companies with between 20 and 500 employees, there are 140,000 of them in Canada. They employ about 5 million Canadians, and that is the problem that employee ownership trust tries to solve. Right? How do we ensure that there's an alternative for those owners trying to sell their companies? We see this as a massive public policy problem. If you do own a company like that and you are looking to retire and you have a business that is sellable, your obvious alternatives right now are to sell to private equity or to sell to a competitor in your industry. We already in Canada, at least in our view, are far too owned by private equity. And we certainly have far too much concentration in different markets. And those are areas of major issue here in Canada. This silver tsunami is poised to make that much, much worse. The other thing, when companies are sold to private equity, they never come out of that, right? So they get sold to another private equity, company, and eventually they end up often in foreign hands as well. So if we want to keep companies Canadian, we want to keep them from continuing our market concentration, we need another option for those owners. So that's where employee ownership trusts come in. Employee ownership trusts are a model that provides an owner the ability to sell to their employees at fair market value using debt. The way that they sell to their employees, at least in the models that are used in the UK and the US, are such that all employees are given shares or are beneficiaries of the trust. And those shares or being a beneficiary in the UK, it's not quite shares, it's profit sharing, but the model ensures that employees don't pay anything for those shares. And for us, we're a nonprofit focused on reducing wealth inequality. The breadth and accessibility of those models are super important to us, right? So models where you can take part of the economy and transition it to people who otherwise do have no access to asset ownership is the thing that we find really exciting about this, as well as their ability to be an answer for that very particular target market that I was talking about before. The reason why employee ownership trusts are successful in that target market is that the governance structure doesn't change, right? So in an employee ownership trust model, there's a trustee that acts on behalf of employees, but the firm continues to be governed similarly to how it was before, often now with an independent board. And that's not like to say that they don't introduce employee voice. They absolutely do. Best versions of employee ownership trusts in the US and the UK over time build in more and more employee voice, more and more employee decision making over time. But at the time that the transaction happens, governance largely stays the same, which is why you have banks willing to lend to it, which is why you have owners willing to lend to it. Right. Remember, in this model, the owner is largely lending the purchase price to the company, hopeful of being paid back later on. So the more stable the company long term, the more likely they feel they're going to get their money, the more willing they are to do that, as opposed to selling it to someone who would be bad for employees and bad for community, as we talked about before. These trusts have been very successful in the US and the UK. In the US, there are now 14 million Americans who are covered by these plans, owning $1.7 trillion in assets from 200,000 employee companies like Publix in the Southeast US, through companies like Taylor Guitars, who we worked with, to Bob's Red Mill, who's probably in your kitchen right now with some product, maybe not Bob himself, but hopefully one of his products, to smaller companies. And then in the UK, of course, John Lewis Partnership and a few other very prominent companies, a lot of architecture firms in the UK. And in the UK, where these were introduced in 2014, they've scaled dramatically to the point where in 2021, almost 300 companies sold to their employees through an employee ownership trust, making approximately 30,000 new employee owners in 2021 alone. Obviously super successful, and then they've been well studied. So we know the wealth effects are dramatic. We know that they lay off fewer people in recessions. We know that they are more resilient in recessions. We know they grow faster. We know they're better for their local communities because they tend to stay in their local communities. Sorry, I'm trying to get a lot in 10 minutes. I feel like I'm talking too fast, but really great outcomes. And so that's why they tend to get really great regulatory environments in the US and the UK with tax incentives, et cetera, because politicians across the aisle love these outcomes. In Canada, we don't have that, and as a result, have very little employee ownership. There's a handful of employee-owned companies across the country, but nothing on the scale of the US and the UK. We wrote a report a couple of years ago advocating for more employee ownership in Canada. We said we need a new trust. We need incentives for that trust, and we need regulations to make sure that these trusts protect the taxpayers and protect employees and are not sort of a tax shield for owners. And there are ways to do that we understand from the US and the UK. It has received pretty wide political support, which is wonderful. And the Liberal Party of Canada have put it in the 2021 budget in terms of saying they'll look into it, 2022 budget saying they will do it. And now we are sort of waiting for what they'll look like. The current state of play is we really don't know. We were hopeful that we would have seen something so far this year. At this point, we are waiting for the next budget to see whether there's anything in there about the details for what these trusts might look like in Canada. But we do know that the government is working on it, and we do expect that sometime over the next year, we're hopeful, I shouldn't say we expect, we're hopeful that sometime over the next year, we'll see more definition around what these will look like in Canada, what form they'll take, and when we'll start to see them. Okay, I think that's sort of the state of employee ownership trusts in Canada. Colin, are there any questions I can answer, or is it not time for that?
I would actually like to throw a quick question at you, which is what would you like to see? Are there things that people in city councils can do to, and they have some ability to set up counseling resources for small businesses in their area? Are there things that city councils should be looking to do in this moment where we have all of these retiring entrepreneurs, most of whom do not have succession plans right now? What can we be doing to help facilitate this process?
Yeah, I mean, so I think the truth is, at least as far as employee ownership trusts are concerned, it's pretty much follow along and see, because there are no real great structures right now to do it. I would say, where there are small businesses who can transition to co-ops are great. I mean, Meg, who I see is on this call, they've done some wonderful work around this. There's there's a lot for small businesses you can do with co-ops and other structures. In order to scale, as happened in the US and the UK, we really do need these regulations that allow 200-person companies to make those transitions, which hasn't really occurred anywhere in the Western world at scale until the trust model was created.
Yeah, that's a fantastic answer. And that sets up the next person wonderfully, whom you've mentioned, which is Meg Ronson with Co-op Zone. And Meg is a economic development professional with a lot of work on cooperative conversions. And so I'll now invite Meg to come in and follow up on that directly. Thank you so much. Thanks, John.
No problem. Hi, Meg.
Hi, can everyone hear me okay?
Yes, perfect.
Wonderful. I'm joining from my partner's grandparents' home in Aurelia, Ontario. We were just away for a weekend away in Collingwood, and my baby is being passed around right now. My brand new 5-month-old baby or 5-week-old baby. So if I look exhausted, that's why.
Fair enough.
But yeah, thanks for the shout out, John. And I just put the report that we published about 5 years ago on co-op conversions in the Ontario context. So very relevant to this audience we did a study and to see what it would look like to try to scale up some cooperative conversions as a strategy for business succession. And so very cool. And then Peter Cameron, who will be speaking later, OCA has a ton of resources on cooperative conversion specifically. But today I'll spend my 10 minutes talking about my newish position as executive director at Co-op Zone, which is the Co-op Zone Developers Network Cooperative. We are a national cooperative that serves all of Canada and sometimes internationally, and we represent co-op developers, and we are kind of we call ourselves a professional peer network of co-op developers, but also lawyers, some lawyers and accountants who serve co-ops and grassroots startups. Grassroots startups of people who want to start co-ops. So to quickly kind of talk about, some people and a lot of people in this call might say, what is a co-op developer? So I'll kind of get into that. A co-op developer is a professional service provider offering expertise to help co-ops start and grow. And because a co-op is both a business and an association of people, it is a unique structure and that sometimes needs special services to navigate its development and growth. Because of course, you have consultants who do business consulting. You have consultants who do nonprofit consulting or even membership association consulting. But co-ops, because they have those two aspects, are a unique animal. And so there is an entire field called co-op development, and that's where Co-op Zone is where those co-op developers assemble and do things. So Co-op Zone has been around for about 10 years now. I've only been involved with Co-op Zone in the last few. I've been a member since probably 5 years ago as a burgeoning co-op developer, and then became the training program director, and now I've taken on as executive director. And it's a small co-op, and we're kind of in a process of scaling up to basically be able to say that we represent all the co-op developers in Canada, but we can't say that yet. We're still kind of evolving, which is basically to be a holding place for all co-op developers, to be a place where resources can be shared and also most often, people are coming to us when they need a co-op developer saying, hey, I need a co-op developer to help me with that. And then, we go up to our members. There's someone who wants to convert to a co-op out in Barrie, Ontario. Who wants to help them? Who can help them, right? And so so co-op developers can be hired at any phase of a co-op's existence. So it's not just startups, it's not just conversions. It can be, a co-op that's a group of people who isn't even sure that they want to incorporate as a co-op. They might say, we have this mission, we have a business that we want to run, or we have an association that we want to be forming, and we're not sure if co-ops or forming a co-op is And so co-op developers brought in to discuss that early stage, and they can deal with succession issues, buyouts. So co-op developers were up in arms when Mountain Equipment Co-op wanted to, or did actually sell. That co-op developer had been involved at an earlier time. They might have been able to help members to, I mean, there was a movement, and John, Peter, and Mike, or maybe not Mike, yeah, co-op developer can help with transitions like that, to prevent them from demutualizing. Co-op developers can help navigate the needs of an organization.
Oh, and sorry for a second there, Meg. As you get a little further away from the microphone, it's going in and out a little bit.
Okay, I'll stop moving my hands. I think that's the problem. No, thank you. And I know my internet connection might cut out, so I apologize for that as well. Yeah, they can help with board challenges if the board is facing if membership is waning and they need help to find more membership. There's a co-op developer can do all kinds of that. So in terms of, sorry, I'm just gonna scroll specifics of what Co-op Zone does. As I said, it's a gathering place for co-op development expertise, training, research, and development. And I use that research and development lightly because that's kind of probably late stage, later stage work that we're going to do. But I often say that people come to Co-op Zone either to consult, to hire, or to become a co-op developer. So that first one, I get a lot of people who are brand new to cooperatives, giving me a call or sending me an email, asking, where do I go? What do I do? What is a co-op? Who do I talk to? So that I love calls like that. I get them all the time. And I've been in the co-op system, the social economy system, for over 5 years now. So that's given me a good amount of time to get to know the networks and the systems fairly well. I also, work in systems thinking at the University of Waterloo part-time. So it's my bread and butter to direct people towards resources that help them navigate a system that they maybe aren't familiar with. So that's the first thing that Co-op Zone does. Is I'm here as executive director supporting folks in finding people and resources that they need. Second thing is, members are all professionals in co-op development, or they represent co-op development or developers in some way. So people can either come to our website and browse our database of members to find a consultant that they want to hire, or I usually suggest that they actually just come to me or our administrator and say, give a quick outline of what they're looking for, and then I can blast it to our membership. And then, so a request for proposals or a request for assistance, I can send that out to our membership, and then they get to self-select as a potential service provider for these people. And finally, one of the biggest things and most things that we has going is our training program. The training program is the only one of its kind, particularly in the world. That's what we say. I haven't found another training program like it. But there's lots of training for folks who want to start co-ops. But what there isn't is lots of training for folks who want to help people start co-ops, like co-op developers. So we have our training program that teaches folks how to teach cooperative development, teaches folks how to develop their own co-ops. And it was created and is continuously developed and delivered by seasoned Canadian co-op developers. Also, there's a mentorship element in which every co-op student who is going through the training program is assigned a mentor that provides the students with extra assistance, which is especially helpful for those students who are in the training program, but then they also have a real world co-op that they might be assisting, or even they might be members of. They might be kind of members of a co-op and they want to have kind of an in-house developer to support them, to support their development. And so they'll do that. They'll take the training program. So how can co-op support your community? We're a co-op development network, developer network. We do have members that are lawyers and accountants that can do that specialty services. There's training for those who want to become co-op developers. I do a lot of advocacy and awareness, like today, where I'm, spreading the good news of co-op development. And then, yeah, we have lots of co-op system knowledge and advice that we can just, for free. You can just call me and I can help you out. And just a shout out to Hazel Corcoran, who is the executive director of Canadian Worker Co-op Federation, who wasn't able to be here today, but they are also kind of they represent that national system of a worker co-op development, which is specialized and also a resource to go to as well.
Yeah, fantastic. Thank you so much, Meg. That's a really invaluable resource. Have you had before people in regional government connect with you about providing counseling services for co-op development in their communities?
So I've actually had some folks approach for like council education. So because we're known for our educational and like training services, sometimes folks will come to me and say, I want our council to be more educated as to what it takes to start or grow or scale a co-op. And then usually what I'll say is, how about I get you to, and then I usually will recommend them to other folks because we're so specialized as co-op developers. It's either like there's some free resources out there that I can point you to, or if you do want to hire a co-op to do that, or a co-op developer to do that training, then I can maybe hook you up. Who does talk to me a lot, or what I'm starting to get more, I'm getting more attention brought to co-op development is the Community Futures Network. So I know that a lot of councils work closely with their economic development organizations, which Community Futures offices are often, integral to that. So I actually have created some close ties with Community Futures offices over the past couple of years to try to advocate that Community Futures offices get more involved in co-op development, have a co-op developer in their office that's ready to, not only support the development of co-ops, but potentially have Community Futures offices finance burgeoning or existing co-ops that are in their community. So yeah, the economic development element of co-op development is there's so many fruit to pick with when council and economic development teams and Peter Cameron at the OCA and myself can work together to make things happen.
That's fantastic. That's wonderful. And that's going to set up our next guests really wonderfully, which is Peter Cameron and Michael Bay. But first, thank you so much, Meg, for your presentation and for the wonderful.
I'm going to head out. Thanks so much for having me, Colin.
Thank you. Take care, Meg. And
bye, Peter.
And John, if you're around, is John Shell still around? He might still be on board. I'll come back to him a little later. I've got a question that's popped up for him that was I didn't get to quite in time, but I'll turn it over to the Ontario Cooperative Association, Peter Cameron and Michael Bay. The floor is yours. Thanks so much.
Thanks, Colin. I really appreciate it, and really enjoyed Matthew's presentation and John and Meg's. I think that I'm going to introduce Michael Bay from homeopportunities.ca because we're working together on, we're taking the community wealth to the next step. We've actually created Community Wealth Cooperative, and we're focusing on the key issue of housing because, the co-op movement has been involved for decades in housing, but of a more rental nature. And in reality, we think that now the time is to create another sector that will promote actual ownership and build on all the principles of social enterprise, community economic development, the co-op 7 principles. And I think you'll be very impressed by the model that Mike has developed, and I will let him take it away. Michael.
Thank you, Peter. Let me just share a PowerPoint. Here we go. Yes, so as Peter introduced, first that we're working with housing. And there was a question earlier, where should we start with community wealth? housing is a good place. It's not necessarily the only place, but housing is a good place to start because it has the potential of creating significant amounts of community wealth. And so the trick with housing is that you need an approach that doesn't require grants and subsidies, or else you're totally beholden to government sources of funding, which are far less than is needed to address the housing needs of most municipalities. Also, if you work without grants and subsidies, the municipalities themselves can get extensively involved because all they have to do is help you identify land. No grants and subsidies means we pay market value for the land. So identifying land is simply who owns land that is willing to be patient to produce a social benefit. So one of the things that's exciting, without grants and subsidies, you can work at any scale. The largest project we're working on at this point in time is 3,000 units. The amount of community wealth that would be created with that project alone would be $150 million. So the scale is quite daunting at some point, but it's just zeros, right, when it comes down to it. Until we have a housing solution, the quality of our society is being greatly affected. I actually saw an interview yesterday related to what the explanation is for why increased violence is occurring in our schools. And the analysis was simply, well, families are under greater stress. When the family is under stress, it feeds down into the kids, and the kids act out as a result. So there are large numbers of people that are paying more than 50% of their income towards their housing in the city of Toronto. And how do you raise a family properly when all your money is going towards housing and you don't even know where you're going to get food for the kids? And so that's what leads to violence in the schools, you know. So the other thing that's interesting is there isn't a community that I've spoken to in Southern Ontario, at least, and fairly broadly in Canada, that isn't suffering for the lack of affordable housing. There are empty jobs that are not being filled because there isn't affordable housing in the community. And there's the inability to attract industry because there isn't affordable housing in the community. So if we can come up with a system that identifies land as the only inhibitor, every community has land. So let me quickly go through the system. This is really just a taste, but it might be quite useful for people to get a sense of what we're up to. I won't spend much time on this. I've been doing and building and developing cooperatives since 1976. But I started doing housing cooperatives in 1979, and I've worked in over 20 jurisdictions around the world. And so the pieces I've brought together to create the current model to start the new housing sector comes from all of that experience. What we've done is created broad coalitions that support what we're doing. So coalitions that are related to delivery, which would be the development consultants that Meg was just speaking to, the sector itself through the Ontario Cooperative Association and others, and of course the financial support from our credit unions. Now I will mention for people's knowledge is that what credit unions have done in Canada in order to address the issue of banks can do more things is a number of the large credit unions have actually started banks, but they've also lobbied government to give them the same authority that banks have. So just a useful thing for the people who are speaking to that. We then go out and find partners in the private sector that are willing to moderate their rates of return in order to support affordable housing. And the best example of that is that we have a large number of real estate agents that will do sales for us for $1,000 a sale. Not 5% of the value of the unit, $1,000 a sale. So that item alone is a 4% savings on the development. So what do we need from government? We don't need grants and subsidies, but from the municipalities, the timing of the payment of their fees and development charges is important, but everything gets fully paid. If there's a delay in payment, we pay interest on the delay so that they're made whole, so they don't have to put in dollars, which means we can work at scale. From the province, we need municipal support to borrow the money that we need from the province, and we're looking for 20% of the market value. And then from CMHC, we need loans from the CMHC program. So we need access to lending programs, which are capable of scaling up much more easily than grant programs. Target for 60 to 70% of the units, because we want blended income communities. They are the healthiest, they work the best. Co-ops have proven that over the years. But for those lower income units, we're targeting 1 bedrooms to incomes between 35 and 40,000, 2 bedrooms between 45 and 50, 3 and 4 bedrooms between 55 and $70,000 annual income. That moves up by $5,000 annually for every 1% increase in interest rate. So where we can adjust to the interest rate, we can still serve very low incomes. These are averages, so we can go a bit lower and a bit higher depending on circumstances. But it's quite exciting to think that we've got a housing program without grants and subsidies that can serve these incomes, because these incomes are just as low as the incomes being served through other programs, but we just don't need grants and subsidies. So we've organized Community Wealth Co-op to be resilient. It's expected in 20 years to be a company that controls $1 billion of venture capital. And so if we're going to control that kind of community wealth, we have to have a broad multi-stakeholder approach. And so we have the co-ops themselves as members. We have social enterprises, because some of the money can be used as seed capital for social enterprises that provide jobs for the hard to employ. So we're looking at jobs and housing. And then, of course, the delivery agencies need a place at the table because they're working so hard to create these corporations. But then any nonprofit, any credit union, and municipalities are nonprofits, have a stakeholder group where they can be members in that category. And then inspirational leaders. So these would be a David Suzuki or a Joe Clark or anybody who's willing to add their personal credibility to the organization. There are only 2 goals that the board of directors has to adhere to. They have to be working with companies that will benefit society and protect the planet. It seems to me if you simplify your goals, at least you know what you're chasing. So very simply, the way that we achieve what we're pursuing is by having a number of investors, including credit unions, the province, CMHC, the purchaser, and ourselves through Community Wealth, putting in money that doesn't have to get paid back till you sell. So by restricting the repayment until resale means that your carrying costs are on less than half the value of the unit. Therefore, you can reach the incomes that you're targeting. Now, the one issue that's wonderful to debate and discuss, but this unit's going to resell into the market. So it's going to cease to be affordable. So I can talk forever on that point, but let me give you one thing to think about. This approach without grants and subsidies could generate 50,000 units a year in Canada. If you're generating 50,000 units a year in Canada, that might be the number of units that are needed every year to address the problem. So if you've addressed the problem in each subsequent year, does it really matter how long the units remain affordable? You've addressed the problem. But on top of that, the model is designed to take the funds that are released on a sale and reinvest it in another unit. So the portfolio remains the same size, but it moves from unit to unit and produces construction activity in the municipalities it's in. Each unit built creates 1.5 jobs. So if you're producing 500 units a year in your municipality, you've created 750 permanent jobs because you're producing 500 units a year. If you produce 500 units a year through grants and subsidies and the grant subsidies end, your jobs disappear. So the reconstruction to solve the problem is a way of maintaining jobs. This is more for your for messaging to the community. The quickest way from low income to middle class is owning a home. So why should we be denying low income people access to a home? In fact, the prices that the carrying costs that we're carrying for in Toronto are the cost of buying a home in Atikokan. So do you have to move to Atikokan to become a homeowner, or should you be allowed to be a homeowner in Toronto because that's where your job happens to be? So we've got a list of supports from the municipalities. Everything is a deferral. Everything is paid back with interest at the point of sale. And I'm not going to go through them in detail. They're here. If this is recorded, I presume they're here for recording. And of course, I'm easy to reach. And this slide, although the pictures seem to cover me, this used to be a picture of the most dangerous hiking trail in the world, which is in China. But I happened to hike the most dangerous hiking trail in North America, which is Angel's Landing in Zion National Park. So I swapped in a picture of me, and the only reason I'm on the trail is because my daughter's up ahead of me. And if your daughter's going on the trail, you have to go on the trail. But there's my contact information. Realize it's the wrong phone number because I now am working from my daughter's former bedroom. And so you get me on my cell number, and the cell number I will put in, you can put in the chat or people can get it through the website, but it's 416-801-2086. So if you put that in the chat for the people that are viewing the live stream, that would be great. So yeah, usually this presentation takes an hour. And then I have to go back for follow-up presentations. So you don't have to absorb it all. There's only one message, is that we can work at scale. We can do it without any level of government having to put grants and subsidies in by way of using lending. And then we can provide the amount of housing that your community needs for an effective economic development strategy.
That's a tremendously exciting program, Mike. Thank you so much for that presentation. I think that also speaks to a lot of the questions that were coming to Matthew earlier on, where people were asking, what's the first foot in the door, or what's a potential first foot in the door? The answer with community wealth work has always been a little bit different. It started really with community foundations and the Democracy Collaborative, which was a think and do tank in the United States. In the case of Preston, the city council really started things. Sometimes it's community partners, sometimes it's councils, sometimes it's now national governments taking on community wealth initiatives. But here you've provided a really simple foot in the door that municipalities can think about acting as partners in a way that doesn't add to their overhead, and is going to start addressing the need for affordable housing and also increasing people who own the places that they live in and have democratic participation where they live. So that's a really, really exciting initiative. I wanted to throw a question your way, which was the same question that I threw at Meg, and then I'm going to come to a question from Nathan that's just been put in the chat. But the question is, do you get asked by municipal governments for counseling on cooperative development? And is that something that you would like to see more of, municipal governments reaching out to people engaged in cooperative organization and development?
Yes, at this point in time, we are only responding to municipalities that approach us because we've been approached by so many municipalities. So, you know, we've been
great news. That's great news.
Yeah, and so we've been successful at actually receiving a grant support from Brampton, and we told them we wouldn't take a grant, that it's a loan. And so we'll set up a revolving pool of funding and we'll give it back to them anytime they want. But you know, we want to stick true to the concept of how we approach things. But you know, we've been able to, and gotten great support out of Centre Wellington, which is really quite a small city in just north of Guelph. And we've been doing well with Kitchener and the region of Waterloo, and we're just starting to launch communications in southwestern Ontario. We're getting a lot of communication, and I've left out some municipalities that have approached us. But we're here. We have the time to answer questions. We don't have the time to chase.
Right, right. Marvelous, marvelous. Great answer. I have a question from Nathan in the chat. How do you think the work on co-op housing relates to the current housing policy in Ontario and B23 in particular? Interesting. Yeah, how does the current policy line up with your objectives?
Well, B23 is very interesting because it caused us to sit down and spend a little while talking among ourselves and saying, how committed are we to no grants and subsidies? And it seemed to come at exactly the perfect time because we don't need to have the development charges waived. It is extremely useful for the development charges to be paid when the houses close. And so what we need to be able to do that is to borrow the money to pay the development charges. The source of that borrowing is Infrastructure Ontario. We're eligible to borrow from Infrastructure Ontario. They've already agreed to lend to us, but they want support from the municipality. So now with support from the municipality, we can pay the municipality the development charges. So them providing the support that the Infrastructure Ontario needs earns them millions of dollars. So it's a much easier conversation to bring all three levels of government together in such a way that none of them have to put in grants and subsidies. So Bill 23 for us is helped us give a benefit to every level of government. And so, you know, we're looking at the possibility of St. Thomas, and we could do 1,000 to 2,000 units in St. Thomas. If we wanted to waive development charges, I would be willing to bet taxes would have to go up by 20 or 30%. That's not what we want to be engaged in. So we want to pay the development charges that are necessary to pay the services that you need to have a properly working community. So anybody who's interested in protecting their tax base can now work with us, which is pretty unusual.
That's a very different approach to some of the rhetoric about what's cost effective. I think that's really important that point gets made and that voice is heard. Thank you so much for answering that very tricky question, but that's a really great answer. I have another question from Regional Councillor Haley Bateman. And Haley, I apologize, I didn't get to one of your questions earlier, but she says, super great news that municipalities are seeking information. Do you have relationships with AMO? AMO.
Yeah, Association of Municipal Officials.
Municipalities of Ontario.
Yeah.
Association of Municipalities of Ontario.
I have done a presentation to the rural municipalities of Ontario, but not the larger association. So no formal relationship. Happy to be involved, happy to talk to them, but I need to be referred. I won't pick up the phone and call them. Which regional municipality is the councillor from?
Niagara region.
I've had conversations in the Niagara region. There actually is a piece of land that was supposed to go for affordable housing that has fallen apart in the city of St. Catharines. Love to be involved in actually making it work because we're not affected by the current economic conditions. And so with the change in economic conditions, a lot of projects went what's called underwater. They weren't viable anymore from a profit point of view. For us, all projects are viable. And so once we start a project, we finish a project. So, but land has to be identified or there isn't much of a conversation to be had. I'm happy to do a presentation to explain why we need land to be identified. But after that, it's really up to the region to come up with the land for us to work on.
Right, right. That's a fantastic answer. Thank you. I would like to take a moment to thank all of our presenters today. We have gone through wonderful presentations from Matthew Brown, from Peter and Mike from the Ontario Cooperative Association, from Meg Ronson from Co-op Zone, from John Schell from Social Capital Partners. We have reached the end of our presentation time today. So I suppose I can open the floor now for we still have Mike and Peter with us. Are there elements of municipal planning, municipal government action that you would particularly like to see put as top priorities moving forward? Obviously, this initiative that you've just spoken to, Mike, is going to be something that you're going to really want people taking a look at. But would you say that's at the top of your priority list for things that you think municipal governments should be looking at in the coming years, especially as we are now really expecting there to be a recession that's such a widespread prediction right now? Are there things from your point of view that should be top of our radar from the point of view of the Ontario Cooperative Association?
Well, I mean, housing, as you just articulated, but the whole model, I mean, municipalities are like a cooperative. It's one member, one vote. The council is the board of directors, and any particular service or product can be supplied by a cooperative. And if there are support structures, as land as an example, and or other services that are not being provided by the private sector, cooperatives can step in with some supports. Obviously, you know, it has to be a viable service, but when the private sector doesn't supply it, we need to step in. And in the case of healthcare, which again has more provincial implications, we are creating personal support worker co-ops in the town of Peterborough, home care worker co-op, one of the first ones. There's also one near Ottawa, a disability service DSW co-op. disability support workers. And they are self-managed, self-government, providing the same service that a, dare I say, a large corporate service that has shown its problems during COVID. We need that support to encourage more of the nurses and PSWs to take control of and provide the services. And the model works, and it just needs more awareness and support.
Yeah, fantastic answer. Fantastic answer.
Now, what I could add to that is, from the perspective of municipalities protecting their budgets, most municipalities have budgets that rely on a certain input of development charges. When we go into a recession and construction stops, this need to provide services for the municipality does not stop. And so the beauty of having and supporting the co-op housing ownership sector is that we can produce construction activity even during the recession. So if you can maintain the volume of construction for your municipality, then you won't face that decline in revenue on the development charge side that could put you into trouble. I know for anybody who's not associated with municipalities aren't supposed to be allowed to generate a deficit. So when you run into the development charges going down, your taxes have to go up. And so it's a pretty delicate situation, and we can help alleviate that should it be useful to the municipality. But you have to start now, because you're a year away from starting construction, even if you fast track the approval process.
It was pointed out that literally as we're talking, there are protests across Ontario. There are protests, and that the promise in Bill 23 has been shown to be a total facade, because not having the development charges, it makes the inability of the municipalities to provide those services you're talking about. And so that's why our model, willing to pay them, is better than the lie that the province has promoted.
But we're not political here.
No, but it is such an important point, especially as a lot of city councillors are speaking out about how this could actually increase the number of costs that they have to pay at the municipal level because of the expanding suburbs. And the model that you've put forward as being something that is cost effective and also does not cause people to throw away those development charges, that source of revenue, is so very important. I think a lot of people are going to want to hear that. I am going to bring Matthew back in a moment. I first wanted to throw one more question to Peter and Mike, which was, and there was a video that was just made in Vancouver with support of Van City that was looking at how the credit unions, which I should point out, I grew up not knowing the difference between a credit union and other kinds of financial institutions. That was something that I learned later on down the road. And they were talking about how the credit unions were so important to providing financial resources for community land trusts and cooperative housing. And so I wondered if you could speak to some of that interrelation between credit unions and these other forms of cooperative wealth. Can you speak to the significance of recognizing those different partners and how they can support each other?
Well, sorry, Matthew. You're asking Matthew or me?
That's an open question for everybody here, because I think it's relevant to everybody present. But any of you could speak to that question, please.
Well, I would like to, in the sense that again, the co-op movement and the credit union movement were created. We like to say we're the original social enterprise, because we stepped in and solved problems where the private sector wouldn't. And in the case of credit unions, the banks, dare I say, were not providing the credit that was needed by people. And so they came together, banded together, and created their own banks, credit unions. And it's happening worldwide. It's about providing other services that really respect the triple bottom line: people, planet, and profit. You got to make money. The question is who controls it. And so, again, housing, childcare, healthcare, even funeral homes. You know, any product or service you can name, there is a co-op answer for it. And it's about, you know, quality service and providing it in a democratic way.
That's a great answer. Matthew, did you want to jump in on that as well?
Yeah, just briefly. No, excellent responses. I think I've always been inspired by the Mondragon experience, and there was 5 pillars. And you know, the first worker co-ops they started, I think there was 2 or 3, and then they realised that they needed access to finance. So what the priest did, who was behind the original movement there, is he actually made the workers bankers, and they're saying, well, we don't have any experience of being bankers, and he was saying, well, it's essential to make sure that we got a financial vehicle which can actually lend and expand worker-owned businesses. So I think, you know, the 4 pillars you have in Mondragon, I think it's essential. I think that needs to be applied in many places, that if you want to expand worker ownership of community land trusts, the large banks often have a duty to make the largest returns for the investors, the owners of the banks, and they're just not going to do it. So you need to have those alternatives in communities. It's a bit more difficult in the UK with credit unions because they are restricted in what they can and cannot do compared to Canada. They can't lend to local businesses, to be honest, at any real degree. And this is why we're establishing our own bank in the Northwest region. But I think, you know, you need to have that access to finance, and it appears credit unions in Canada are excellent to do that.
Yeah, that's a great answer. That's a really great answer.
What I would mention is the piece that community wealth tends to not pay attention to as much as we think they might, is venture capital. Because most of these community organizations need some source of venture capital. Now they can often, if they're lucky with their municipal support, for instance, they can get it from government. But where they can't, if they have to go to venture capitalists for it, they're held to ransom.
Right.
And so this is why I'm kind of excited about working in the housing space, because it creates the venture capital that's needed for the entire rest of the community wealth sector. And so it can act as the instigating force. Like 60 to 70% of the wealth in our society is created through real estate development and appreciation. And if we ignore that source of wealth, we will never change the system.
Right.
So we are committed to changing the system. And just a quick mention, the system that we're using is Indigenous business practices.
Yeah.
Where basically the elders of the community control the reallocation of resources for the benefit of the community. That practice has proven over 10,000 years to be the most effective. And so to think somehow the Europeans came up with something better, they didn't. They just came up with something more destructive.
Yeah, it's a provocative answer, but I think one that feeds into the overarching themes of this conference really, really well. I'd like to thank you all for your wonderful presentations, your wonderful insights. I've learned a great deal. I know a number of others have learned a great deal from this, and also for making your resources and your strategies available to us all. We need them in this moment. We are facing a challenging moment. Everybody's trying to figure out how to build sustainable and inclusive forms of wealth. And there are a lot of forces that are trying to push us away from being able to do that. But we can take these methodologies and look at that thing that Mike was just talking about of changing the feedback loops. We can get things that build good things that build other good things. And you've all provided wonderful ways forward to do that and to find good, effective steps in our communities that can help us in the coming years. So I want to thank all of you so much for being here today. This meant a lot to me, to the people watching, and to our various communities. Thank you so much for being here.
You're welcome.
And thanks everybody for tuning in. I will be making sure that if you have any follow-up questions, you can simply send them to communitywealthcandidates@gmail.com, communitywealthcandidates@gmail.com. You can also track me down on social media, and I'll make sure that any questions that you have can be followed up on. You also have these wonderful resources that you can turn to that were here with us today. Thanks so much for tuning in, and we look forward to building more sustainable forms of wealth in the future with you all. Thank you. Cheers.